I'm Brian Ferguson. I'm a professor of anthropology and the director of the new graduate program in Peace and Conflict Studies at Rutgers University in Newark. I'm going to be talking today about an article that I published in American Ethnologist in 1990 called Blood of the Leviathan. Anthropology didn't do much on the subject of war in the first half of the 20th century. There were a couple of articles around World War I and World War II, but nothing sustained. The drawn-out war in Vietnam changed that. It focused everybody's attention on war. It certainly focused my attention on war since I was facing the draft. And a substantial body of literature accumulated. There were schools of thought. There were ecological anthropologists that tried to explain war in terms of some form of adaptation to the natural environment. There were social structuralists who looked at war in relationship to, say, patrilocal post-marital residence as encouraging warfare patterns. A lot of good work was produced there, but they were all rather abstract in the sense that they talked about war as a general cultural pattern, war among the so-and-so. And they rarely talked about actual specific wars. Meanwhile, in other literatures, historical studies were clearly demonstrating how indigenous warfare patterns changed in colonial situations. My goal in Blood of the Leviathan was to bring history into anthropological theory on war. And I did that with a very simple method, looking at the societies of lowland South America, Greater Amazonia. I took all of the cases that had been studied by anthropologists as basis of some form of theoretical generalization and put them in their actual historical context, what was going on when the wars really happened. And when you did that, you saw in all of the cases, it's very clear that the warfare was decidedly connected to aspects of the colonial encounter. That had to be brought into focus to understand why people were fighting. And it wasn't that the theories that had been made before were wrong, but that they were lacking, they were deficient, and in some cases, they really distorted what actual warfare was like because they weren't looking at actual fighting. And they often mischaracterized the actual violence that occurred because they didn't look at real cases of fighting. If you did that, if you looked at them in historical context, you saw that wars among the indigenous people that were the basis of so much anthropological theorizing, a lot of them were due to some form of demographic disruption, such as groups being pushed out of their territory by an expanding frontier into somebody else's territory. Other wars, many wars, were done at the behest and under the control of rivalrous European imperial powers. Other wars were geared towards obtaining some of the Western goods that entered native trade systems and quickly became necessities, such as steel tools. So altogether, if you want to have a generalization, the most common explanation for war in lowland South American societies was Western contact, which includes all aspects of Western contact. And that's what Blood of the Leviathan talks about. This was part of a longer-term interest in bringing history into the anthropology of war. I'd written previously about the history of contact and warfare in the Pacific Northwest coast. And at the time Blood of the Leviathan came out, I was already deep into a project with my good buddy, Neil Whitehead, that led to the book War in the Tribal Zone. Tribal zone is an area that's not under the direct administration of a state, but it is materially affected by the proximity of an expanding state, of a colonial process. And in tribal zones, warfare changes. The practice of warfare invariably is transformed. It's different than it was before. It's frequently intensified, and sometimes it's generated where war hadn't existed before that. And sometimes tribal zones also lead to the imposition of peace, although unfortunately it's often the peace of the dead. I continued on with this study of history and war by looking at the Yanomami. You all know that Napoleon Chagnon and his books about the Yanomami portrayed them as representing our contemporary ancestors, representing life and war, basically at the beginning of the Neolithic and the Stone Age. Everybody asked me about the Yanomami wherever I went, so I had to get into that literature. And I spent several years reading pretty much everything that anyone had ever written about the Yanomami. And I produced a book, Yanomami Warfare. And what that book shows is that not only were the Yanomami not pristine and untouched in a state of nature, that the Yanomami their world had been affected by imperial encroachments since the early 17th century, and ever since then. By the time Napoleon Chagnon arrived, the Orinoco-Mavaca area, with these two rivers where he worked, had been radically transformed by factors of disease and the intrusion of Westerners who gave out machetes and axes, which became vital necessities for the Yanomami. I mean, the Army Corps of Engineers was there at one point. So this was not a pristine state of nature. And when you got down to cases and you looked at the actual examples of war in a comparative way, all Yanomami wars at all times, I maintain that they are predictively explained as an outgrowth of antagonisms that are rooted in conflicting interests over access to metal tools. I just published a paper called The Origins of War and Peace in Europe and the Near East, or something like that, in which I argue that what might be the first tribal zone in the world can be witnessed about 5,000 years ago in the ancient Near East. Now, the area that I'm talking about is the southern Levant, which includes contemporary southern Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and most of Israel. Very warlike area today, as we all know. This has been an intensively excavated region. This is one of the places where plants and animals were domesticated. For about 10,000 years, there is no substantive evidence of any war whatsoever in the southern Levant, when other areas in the Near East, contemporary with it, have abundant evidence of war. It seems that it really was not there. Now, this is a very interesting finding in its own right. It means that humans can live in peace. We've been doing more to study peace in anthropology, and we understand now that peace is not just an absence of war, that peace has its own social bases. And in the southern Levant of 13,000 to about 3,000 BC, I argue, and it's a theory, that the people who domesticated plants and animals also domesticated conflict. They found ways to deal with conflict that didn't involve going out and killing lots of people. Then that all changed in an archaeological blink of an eye about 3200 BC, where archaeologists hadn't been able to find definitively a single defensive wall for the 10,000 years before that. Suddenly every major village has a wall around it. What happened? What happened is that the Egyptians, who had been trading and settling in the southern Levant for a few centuries before that, they changed because in Egypt we saw the rise of the pharaohs, and Egypt became an imperial power, and virtually overnight the southern Levant became a violent tribal zone. So even if you're looking at the archaeological past, you have to put things in what would have been experienced as historical change, something that happened in less than a century, transformed the practices of war in that part of the Near East. Blood of the Leviathan is arguing that historical context is essential, and not just for ancient times, for indigenous history, for all war or large-scale violence. If you understand the context, then knowing when something happened can really show you why it happened. I'm interested in developing a scientific understanding of war. And I use that word advisedly. It means I come up with testable generalizations and then go look for evidence that supports or contradicts it. Those generalizations have to be put into specific historical situations. For example, the Yanomami case that I was talking about, the generalizations about them fighting for access to Western manufactured goods would not apply in the historical period when they were mainly just running from slave raiders. That was a very different situation. It doesn't work. So you've got to be historically specific. And it also works for modern wars. No one would think of describing modern wars and leaving the history out of it. And anthropology has gone in that direction. The anthropology of war has changed dramatically since I first got started in this. It's gone in a lot of different directions. Unfortunately, it always has new material to work with. Most anthropologists today aren't studying wars among people such as the Yanomami. They're looking at wars within contemporary states, not just wars, but political violence on a large scale. It's the stuff you see in the newspapers. And in doing this, the importance of history is axiomatic. Everybody brings this in. They have to. And with historical context, then what the anthropologist does is delves deeper, goes into the political patterns or the social trends or the value systems that are involved to try and comprehend why situations lead to deadly violence. There's a collection of these that I put together right around the end of the Cold War in a book called The State, Identity, and Violence. And in that, I think some things of some importance stand out. One is the importance of history, of course, but also is the importance of looking at war and other forms of violence in a hierarchy of context. There's layers of conflict. There are very, very local circumstances that need to be studied. What's going on at the level of a village. There's also things somewhat large, like a provincial system of conflict. There's the nation itself, or the state itself. There's a geographic region. There's the global context. And all of these have consequences that affect war and other forms of political violence. Anthropologists need to look at those different levels. And I think another thing that is a useful way to start an analysis of war, and it's not the be-all and end-all of things, but is to focus on the political leaders. Leaders play a large role in shaping political violence. They also respond to other pressures, certainly, but it's their focal point. And very often leaders benefit from violence. It's something that I boil down to a kind of a mantra that leaders often favor war because war favors leaders, at least up until the point where it goes wrong and they get their heads chopped off. But it doesn't look that way in the beginning. So if you are looking at contemporary cases of warfare and other forms of mass violence, history is essential. Understanding the layers of context are important, and a focus on leaders, I think, is very important as well. Now, this is never going to be boiled down to some kind of formula, some kind of easy explanation. It's frustrating because sometimes people will say to me, well, what's your explanation of war? Well, life is too complicated for that. What I think anthropology can do is offer better comprehension of the kinds of situations and circumstances and factors that contribute to violence or lead away from it. And I mentioned in the beginning that I'm the director of a new master's program in peace and conflict studies at Rutgers in Newark. Our goal there is to educate these students so that they can understand conflict situations, that they understand the social and cultural bases of both conflict and cooperation, and what leads to violence, but also what leads away from violence, and, dare I say it, towards peace with justice. Now, this is something it's a high goal, and we're not going to be satisfied or happy until our students master this and go out and start changing the world. That's what we want to see happen.